All right, as we move along in our survey or our overview of the Old Testament, in the days before Israel had a king, we have covered the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the leaders of the 12 tribes. We looked at the exodus of God's bringing Israel out of the land of Egypt, and here we are at the edge of the land of Canaan, ready for the conquest, which is the next period. Now, let me just review where we are. On the east side of the Jordan, at the north up there, you see the Sea of Galilee. It's called the Sea of Chinnereth in those days. The Jordan River flows out of the Sea of Galilee into what is called the Salt Sea in those days. We know it as the Dead Sea. Now, just as the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness because of Israel's unfaithfulness of God's command to go in and take the land, God began to give them victories. And so far, at the east and northeast of the Sea of Galilee, east of the Jordan River, and east of the Dead Sea, Israel has conquered all of those Amorites, and they are in control of that territory. They are now still on the east side of the Jordan River, just opposite the city of Jericho. Now, they are now about to cross that Jordan River and to fight the battle of Jericho. But before engaging Jericho in battle, spies were sent to Jericho. And Joshua the son of Nun secretly sent 2 men from Shittim. You know, there are places in every state that are named for biblical names. There's, Jericho and all that. But how come nobody's ever discovered a city in Alabama named Shittim? Who wants to be from that city? Okay. Go view the land. Specifically, Jericho, he tells these 2 spies, and they went and they came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and lodged there. Oh, doesn't that sound just like a spy story? These spies are always meeting up with some loose women, aren't they? Well, let me tell you how they ended up with Rahab. First of all, it was orchestrated by the Lord, because Rahab isn't just your run-of-the-mill girl who gets money for having sex with men. She makes her living having sex with men in order to help them to worship their God. So if people come into town and they go to Rahab's house, they're probably thinking, well, they worship the same God we do, so there's nothing to worry about. But the king finds out about it, and he sends word to Rahab, I know that you have entertained a couple of Israelite men, so bring them out. But Rahab, obviously, from the story this morning, has hidden these fellows. And then she tells them, as she lowers them out of her window, because she's high up in the wall. Remember, Jericho has got a wall around it. It actually has a double wall around it. Excavations and archaeology has demonstrated that during that time, Jericho was surrounded by a double wall. One was a little bit higher than the other one, and she has to let them out of a window on a rope. And she tells them, now don't be heading back to the Jordan to cross over to your own people, because the king's men are going to be out there looking for you. Instead, go up into the hill country and hide there for 3 days. Okay, you see where Jericho is on the map. Well, look just south of it, and you can see that there's a ridge of mountains there. And that's probably where the guys were for 3 days, because the king's men went from Jericho on down to this area right here, where there are a couple of really good places to cross the Jordan River, because at this time of the year, the Jordan is overflowing its banks. Why? Well, back up in the very northern part of Israel, you've got mountains like Mount Hermon, which is 9,000 feet up. Most of the time when you're over there, you can't even see Mount Hermon because it's covered with fog, because there's snow up on the mountain, and the condensation makes clouds around there. But when that snow begins to melt, guess what? All the streams and the rivers get kind of deep, and the Jordan overflows its banks, and that's why you've got that wide valley there. So the guys eventually cross back over to the Jordan and meet up with Joshua. And then the two men came down again from the hills, passed over, and came to Joshua the son of Nun, and they told him the whole story about meeting up with Rahab and what they promised Rahab and hiding in the hills. And now they're there and they're about to give him the report. So they said to Joshua, we may as well turn around and go back because there's no way we can conquer this city. Now, is that what they say? No, it's right there up on the screen. They said to Joshua, truly, the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and moreover, the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of us. Who said that that would happen? God. If God says something's going to happen, guys, it's going to happen. Now, you remember 38 years earlier, when 12 spies were sent out at Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and they came back and said, yeah, it's a good land, but there's no way we can take it because those guys are bigger than we are, and they have bigger armies, and they have fortified cities. And Joshua himself was one of those spies. And of course, he's holding his breath, thinking, what are they going to say when they come back? And they come back, and they say, man, this is ours. We've got this, Joshua. And it must have warmed his heart to know that their hearts were linked with his in confidence of what the Lord can do. So, next thing, Israel, all 2 or 3 million of them, have to cross the Jordan River from the east to the west. And when they do, this is how it goes. They get the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle, and they cover it up. Why? Because nobody is supposed to see the Ark of the Covenant. And they carry it on poles. Why? Because nobody is supposed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. And I want you to keep that in mind for future stories. And they get the Ark of the Covenant, and Joshua sends the priests that are carrying it out in front of the people. And when they get to the Jordan River, there's this great big overflow. The Jordan River at this juncture in time is probably almost a mile wide. Normally, it's not any wider than this building right here. But it's overflowing. And as soon as the sandals of the priest touch the water flees from out underneath them, and they step onto dry land where the Jordan River used to be. So if they're moving to the west and the Jordan River flows from north to south, guess what? There's this wall of water on their right. But unlike when they pass through the Red Sea, there's no wall of water on the left because that water just keeps on going down into the Dead Sea. So this water over here has got a wall that keeps getting higher and higher because the water keeps flowing down. And God keeps blocking it right there. In fact, it backed up 15 miles up to the city of Adam, which was 15 miles away. Now, these guys with the poles holding the Ark of the Covenant that is overlaid with gold, so it's probably not light, and not to mention it's got the stone 10 Commandments inside of it. They have to stand there while the rest of the nation walks by them on dry ground. Several million people. Now, when all the people get across over onto the west side, then the priests bring the Ark of the Covenant up, and as soon as they step onto dry land, the water comes flowing back. But before that happens, Joshua has the leaders of Israel, 12 of them, grab a stone for each tribe, and they put it over on the west bank and piled them up as a memorial. You know, like us when we make a monument or a statue to remember a historic battle. Well, they did that back in those days, primarily just with stones. And that's not the only monument he made. He had them take 12 other stones and take them back to where the priest stood, where the water used to be, and he piled 12 stones up there. But as soon as the river came by, it buried those, didn't it? So what's the use? Well, the river isn't always overflowing its banks. And then when it comes down and it appears, the people of the land get to look out and say, oh yeah, I remember what that's there for. Because you're going to have Israelites living on this side of the river and Israelites living on that side of the river, and there's always going to be a memorial to remind them of how God got the nation across the river. So, they camped at a place called Gilgal. I don't think there was a place called Gilgal. I think that's just what they named the place where they camped, because archaeologists have never been able to find this place. They found Jericho. That's no problem. I've been to Jericho. But Gilgal is somewhere in the plain, in the Jordan Valley, and the people at Jericho can probably look right on down there and see all of these Israelites. Now, a number of things happened while they were at Jericho. And the first one is that all of the males got circumcised. But Jim, didn't God say that every male born to the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had to be circumcised on the 8th day? Well, guys, the people that were brought out of Egypt, were they a real obedient bunch? No, they were stubborn and rebellious. And that's because every single one of them, 20 years old and above, is dead except for Joshua and Caleb. So they weren't known for doing the right things. But God says this is a sign of the covenant between me and you're not part of my covenant unless you get circumcised. So all of the males, at least 1,730 of them, have to get circumcised before God is going to give them victory in the land. And they do while they're camped there at Gilgal. That's not the only thing that happens. The Passover was celebrated. Now, the Passover probably has not been celebrated since the tabernacle was completed. Because you know the next thing that happened after they celebrated that Passover 38 years before is they rejected God's plan to go into the Holy Land, to conquer it, and to take over. Do you remember what the Passover is significant for? Saving the people from the death angel? Well, what did God promise all those people that were rebellious? To save them from the death angel? Nope. He says over the next 38 years, y'all gonna die. God was living in the south end of heaven when he said that. Okay? And they did. So there was no saving them from the death angel, so there's no sense celebrating the Passover. But now God reminds them that he is going to deliver them from death, and they are going to be victorious, so they celebrate the Passover. And that also gives us a clue as to what time of the year it was, besides that the Jordan was overflowing its banks. When is the Passover? Well, depending upon the year, it's usually March or April, in the spring of the year. So we know when this took place. The very day after the Passover. Now remember, what have the people been eating for 40 years? Manna. That's stuff that they find on the ground when they come out of their tents every morning. The day after the Passover, no more manna. Like some Republican got in office and said, sorry, no more food stamps. No more free meals. You've been wandering around for 40 years and I've been taking care of you, and now it's time to go to work. And they got to eat of the grain and the grapes and everything else that grew in the land. And they're around Jericho. And Jericho is known as the city of palms. So they've got a lot of dates that they can eat. Not dates that they go out on Saturday night. So there's no more manna. And while they're at Gilgal, Joshua gets the battle plan from God. And this is what it sounds like. The Lord said to Joshua, look, I have given Jericho into your hand. It's a done deal. with its king and its mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. And this you shall do for 6 days. They just march around the city once. It's about a third of a mile around the city of Jericho. So you got 1,000 men marching around the city once, every day for 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. So they got the ark out there too. And on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times. That's about 3.5 miles. The priests blowing the trumpets, and when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear that sound, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him. So Joshua gives some instructions just before they do that on the 7th day. On the 7th time around, you're going to hear a long blast on these ram's horns. But before you go in the city, I want you to know that there's a gal in there named Rahab, and in her window, because she lives in the wall, there's a scarlet cord. Do not destroy anybody that is in that residence, but we're going to bring them out alive. Everybody else, put it to death. Everything that breathes, put it to death. And do not touch any gold, any silver, any clothing, anything that is valuable, because all the other cities that we'll take, you can have all that stuff. But on the first city, the first part belongs to the Lord. And this is going to be put in the treasury of the tabernacle. And so they march around 7 times, and Joshua tells them to shout. And you know what they shouted? War Eagle. No, well, that's just what Frank Barker or Breyer would say. Okay, and let me tell you what happens. The walls fell down flat, but it doesn't say that, does it? It says the wall fell down flat, because people have asked me. Now, if Rahab lived in a wall, and the wall was high enough so that the Israelite spies couldn't just jump out the window, they had to be let down with a rope, then if the wall fell flat, everybody that was in the apartment would become part of the rubble. Well, it says right there in the last sentence, and the wall of the city fell down flat. It may have been just one wall that all the Israelites were lined up in front of. And this would be to their advantage, because if that fell down flat and the other walls remained, nobody in the city got to run away and to escape, and they could destroy every one of them just like God said. So maybe Rahab's apartment was in part of the wall that did not fall. You with me? Good. Okay. So that's how Jericho was taken. And boy, are they a bunch of happy campers. They feel invincible. So they go back to Gilgal down in the valley, because that's going to be their headquarters for a while. And lo and behold, what's the next city? Well, if you look up a little bit northwest of where Jericho is, you'll see a little city by the name of Ai. Now, some preachers call it Ai. I don't know if they're pronouncing it or just spelling it, but I'm going to call it Ai because I like speaking with a Scottish accent. It's Ai. And so Joshua decides to send some spies up that way. So Joshua sent men from Jericho up to Ai, which is near Bethaven, east of Bethel, and said to them, "Go up and spy out that land." And the men went up and they spied out Ai, and they returned to Joshua, and they said to him, "Hey, don't be sending everybody up there. Let it be about 2,000 or 3,000 men and go up and attack Ai. I mean, we can take these guys with just one hand tied behind my back, and don't make all the people work to go up there, because they are just a few people." So Joshua errs on the side of caution, and instead of sending up 2,000, he does send up 3,000. So 3,000 Israelites went up there from the people, and they fled before the men of Ai. What? God didn't say this was going to happen. God said that he was going to drive these people out from before us, and they're making us run away. Not only that, the men of Ai killed about 36 of Israel's people and chased them before the gate as far as Shebarim and slew them there at the descent. And the hearts of the people, the Israel people, melted and became as water. Whoa, the tables have turned. The people in the land are afraid of the Israelites, and now the Israelites are afraid of them again. And you can imagine that the men of Ai are now renewed in their courageousness. Wow. So how does Joshua respond to this? He gets on his face before the Lord, and he is weeping and crying. And Joshua said, "Alas, O Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all?" In other words, why didn't you just leave us on the other side? To give us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? Oh, that we had been content to dwell beyond the Jordan. Now, who does Joshua sound like? He sounds just like the generation that he grew up in, that always said, oh, that we had died in Egypt. Why did God bring us out here into the wilderness to die? And Joshua is sounding just like the generation that was put to death by the Lord because of talk, just like that. And the Lord essentially says, quit your sniveling, Joshua. He says to him, get up. Why have you fallen on your face this way? Israel has sinned. I haven't failed them. They have transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them, and they have taken some of the devoted things. You remember what I told you earlier? Don't touch anything that is valuable in the city. It belongs to the Lord. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own stuff. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies because they have become a thing for destruction. And I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you which have been stolen. They belong to me. So, we got to find out who did this. So Joshua conducts an investigation. Yeah. Anyway, it turns out that the culprit is a man from the tribe of Judah, from the family of Zerah, and his name is Achan. And Joshua approaches him and he says, son, tell me what you did. Don't hold it back and don't lie from me. So Achan answers Joshua, of a truth I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle, that's just like a cape or an outer covering of clothing, from Shinar. Shinar is the land of Mesopotamia. And 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them. What's the 10th commandment? You shall not covet. Why? Why does God not want you to want? Because wanting, the more you think about it, the more your mind is going to invent some schemes of how to get what you want. And some of those schemes are going to be righteous, and some of those schemes are going to be unrighteous. Achan chose the unrighteous path. He says, I coveted them and I took them. And behold, they are hidden in the earth inside of my tent with the silver underneath. Wow. What a heartbreaking thing. And so Joshua said, why did you bring trouble on us? The Lord is bringing trouble on you. And all Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned them with fire and stoned them with stones, and they raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day, and the Lord turned from his burning anger. Folks, that is an awful way to die. And they didn't do it behind prison walls. Their execution was public, so that all of the adults and all of the children can see the consequences for sin, and that God takes this stuff seriously. So, now they still have to conquer Ai. So how are they going to do it? Well, God's got a plan. You see where Ai is? You see that little square? That represents the fortified city. This time, Joshua takes 30,000 men, and he hides just to the west of that little block. He hides 5,000 of them in the woods just to the west of the city. And he features the other 25,000 just north of the city. And there's a ravine between the city and Joshua's men. And so they come out there in the early morning, and the men of Ai see them out there across the ravine going, na 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 na. And they rush out of Ai, and they pursue them down the bank. And just as soon as they start running toward Israel, Israel starts running away. But friends, they're faking it, because they want the men of Ai to chase them. Because the people, the 5,000 who are west of the city, see this, and they sneak into the city and they set it on fire. And so Israel's running away, staying just ahead of the men from Ai. And somebody from Ai says, "Wait, guys, our city's on fire." And they turn around and they run back for the city. Meanwhile, the Israelites turn around and start chasing them back to the city. Also, meanwhile, guess who comes out of the city? The 5,000 other Israelites. And now the men of Ai are between the 5,000 and the 25,000, and they don't have a prayer. And they slaughter them out there beyond the city. And after they had finished slaughtering all the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness where they pursued them, and all of them to the very last had fallen by the edge of the sword, all Israel returned into Ai, and they struck it with the sword, all the people who were left in there. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. Now, if that's just a little city, which is 12 times the size of the village that I grew up in, you can imagine how big Jericho was and how many inhabitants were there. Okay? All right, what does God want us to know? First of all, we can trust him. We can trust God. Why did the other 2 million people out in the wilderness die? Because they failed to trust God. They let fear overrule their trust. Fear is the opposite of faith, but we can trust God. God had told them in a number of times and in a number of ways that when they go into the land, no man shall be able to stand against you. The Lord your God will lay the fear of you and the dread of you upon all the land that you shall tread, just as he promised you. And sure enough, Rahab bears witness to this. She said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea." How long ago was that? 40 years earlier. They're still thinking about it. When you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, which was a number of months before, beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no courage left in any man because of you, for the Lord your God is he who is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Another testimony. In Joshua chapter 5, when all the kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites that were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over. They haven't even won a battle. They're just crossing over the Jordan, but God divided it for them. Their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. Did God say he would do it? Did God come through for them? And he will for you as well. Now they're back at Gilgal. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the people of Israel. This was before they went to Jericho. When the circumcising of the nation was all done, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. All right, now let me take you to the map. There's Jericho. Jericho is up in elevation. Gilgal is down almost in the valley, the Jordan Valley. Who's got the advantage? If you're going to have a fight with somebody, do you want the higher ground or the lower ground? Yep, Jericho's got the advantage. Now think back a few hundred years before. Jacob has 12 sons, but he also has a daughter named Dinah. And Dinah decided that she would do a little exploring and try to get to know the people of the town. And she went out unescorted and got raped by the prince of Shechem. Wow. Her brothers are angry. And so Shechem and his father come to pay Jacob a visit. Jacob hasn't done a thing about what happened to his daughter. Someone was definitely in the kitchen with Dinah. And so, his sons take things into their own hands. And they say, you want to marry with us? You're going to have to get circumcised. And they were so delighted that every last man in Shechem, from the king and the prince all the way down, got circumcised. And 2 or 3 days later, while they were healing and hurting so bad because they could not defend themselves, Simeon and Levi, 2 of Jacob's sons, went in and slaughtered every single man in the city. Now, fast forward to Israel's situation at Gilgal. They all got circumcised. They're hurting. Wouldn't this be a great time for all of the people in the land to just come down upon them and wipe them out when they can't even defend themselves because they're not done healing yet? And Joshua says, all right, everybody's getting circumcised. I would have said, Josh, you think this is really a good move right now? But they trusted the Lord, because this generation that has grown up in the wilderness that saw what happened to their parents because they refused to trust the Lord, they have every confidence that the Lord is going to keep them safe until they heal from their circumcision, because God is a God that can be trusted. Another thing that we learn from this story is that God's anger must be propitiated. I know that's a big $50 word. But if God is angry, he must be appeased. You know, it's just like a Rottweiler that's guarding a house and he's angry at any visitor. And you toss him a steak and suddenly he's your best friend. Well, that's propitiation. God's anger against sin must be propitiated. God does not just get over sin. I can remember there was a big party that a bunch of us were going to in high school. And I was talking to a girl at school, and she said, because of what I did last Saturday night, I am grounded for a month. And I said, does that mean you're not going to the party this coming Saturday? She goes, oh no, I'll be there. She goes, Daddy will be over it by then. God does not just get over it, folks. God is a righteous judge. He is holy, and his wrath against sin and sinners must be propitiated. So, Joshua says, why did you bring trouble on us, Achan? The Lord brings trouble on you today. And Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned them with fire, and stoned them with the stones, and raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day. And notice this last statement. Then the Lord turned from his burning anger. If the wages of sin is death, how is the anger of the Lord appeased? With a death. And John tells us that Jesus Christ is our propitiation. He died the death to appease God's anger against our sin in our place. He is the propitiation, the satisfaction, the thing that dispelled God's anger against all who would believe in him. He is our propitiation. What else does God want us to know? Well, how come the verse didn't go away? You'll see. We must not participate in other people's sin. I don't know if you noticed this in the wording. Third line down. And all Israel stoned him with stones. Who's that? That's Achan. And if you got stoned, you'd be Achan too. But now I want you to notice the change in personal pronoun. And then they burned them with fire and stoned them with stones. Who's that? That's Achan's family. Well, why should they be punished for what Achan did? Because they knew about it and they didn't tell anybody. They may even have helped him dig the hole to bury the treasure. In any case, they participated in his sin. And God isn't putting up with that either. We must not participate in other people's sin. God, in the commandments, has a couple of things. If you've got a son that is rebellious, he's a drunk, he's an addict, he doesn't listen to anything you say, you just let him get away with it because there's nothing you can do with him? No, you're to bring him before the elders of the city, and the elders of the city will take him out and stone him to death with stones, so that this thing might be ended in Israel. Otherwise, you are participating in his sin if you do nothing about it. Fast forward a few hundred years. Eli, the prophet, who is also the high priest in Israel, sitting at the tabernacle. And God says, Eli, you've got two sons that are priests that are having sex with the women at the tabernacle. And not only that, they're stealing sacrifices from me and from the people and threatening them with bodily harm. You better do something about it. And Eli did not. And not only did it cost Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's sons, their lives, it cost Eli his life as well. We must not participate in anybody's sin. God also says to the people of Israel, if your best friend, the one who's closer to you than your brother, whispers in your ear secretly saying, let us go worship another god, you don't say, nah. You turn him in. And when he's stoned, your hand must be the first to throw the stone. We do not participate in another person's sin. Same verse. What else do we learn? Even our secret sin affects other people. Who in Israel knew what Achan did? Just Achan and his family and the Lord. Nobody in Israel had any idea. But they paid for it, didn't they? They lost the battle of Ai first time around. And the lives of 36 soldiers who had every confidence that God was going to give them victory. All because of one man's secret sin. Even our secret sin affects others. Your secret sin might affect the prosperity or the success of your family. It might affect the success and fruitfulness of your church. Our secret sin can affect others. Very, very important that we come clean before the Lord. God is kind to anybody who turns to him. Who in this story turned to God? Rahab. Rahab the prostitute. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given friendly welcome to the spies. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Rahab is not just the kind of prostitute that collects money so she can have sex with men. Rahab helped people worship the God of Jericho by having sex with them. That's how their God was turned on by that sort of thing. When he saw people worshiping him by having sex with a cult prostitute, it turned him on. And he made everybody, all the rainfall and the soil fertile, and women had lots of babies. At least that's what they believed. That's a great religion, huh? We could fill this church up. So Rahab was not just a fornicator. She was an idolater, and she helped other people be idolaters. That's the kind of person that she was. But she found favor in the eyes of the Lord by turning to God. Let's examine that. Some of the things that she says. Remember, we're saved by the truth. And truth implies there is a certain amount of content that we know. Rahab tells the spies, I know that Yahweh has given you the land. Okay? All the other people in Jericho are scared to death. Rahab is scared too. But the rest of the people in Jericho probably don't believe that God has given them the land. Rahab speaks of it the same way God does. It's a done deal. I'm going to do it. It's going to happen. And Rahab has every confidence that Yahweh has given Israel the land. So that's faith right there. And that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and so on like that. And that's not all she says. She says, and as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no courage left in any man because of you. What did the rest of the people do? They just stayed holed up in Jericho, shaking in their boots. But Rahab decided to do something about it. I want to be with the winning side. And what made this decision for her? She said, for the Lord, your God, is he who is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now, think of yourself as somebody from that time. Everything above you, the clouds, the sun, the stars, the birds, everything up there, that's the heavens. And on earth beneath, the waters, the fish, everything that crawls on the land. Is there anything else? No. So who's God over all of it? She said, the Lord your God is he who is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. You know what this communicates? This communicates that Rahab has rejected her former God, whom she helped people worship by having sex with them, and saying, the only God that I recognize now is the God who is above all heaven and all earth. Folks, that is a statement of conversion. And what does she do? She knows she's in danger of death because of her sin and the sin of her people. And instead of running away from God and hiding, she ran to God for rescue. because God is kind to those who turn to him. When I was in the Marine Corps, I got a part-time job playing the piano in a dining room at the Staff NCO Club at Camp Lejeune. And there was a great big Steinway grand piano in the dining room, and pretty much, unless I went to the men's room, that's where I stayed. 2 rooms away was the bar in the Staff NCO Club, and occasionally a cocktail waitress would come in and bring a drink that somebody had left at the bar who was now in the dining room. And there was a girl named Sue, very pretty girl, who worked as a cocktail waitress, and she came in and she smiled and she waved at me like this. And when the waitresses and the club manager saw this, they came over to me and said, "Jim, you stay away from that girl, because she has bedded just about everybody that she's ever looked at." And so I was afraid of this girl. And a couple of times I had gone to the men's room, and she's just hanging out outside of the men's room. And when I came out, she smiled and waved to me, and I just said, "Hi," and kept right on going into the dining room. Well, one day she brought a drink in to a customer who had left his drink at the bar, and she comes over to the piano, and I'm trapped. I'm in the middle of a song. And she goes, "Is your name Jim?" I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "My name is Sue." "How do you do?" No. She goes, "You're a Christian, aren't you?" And I stopped playing, and I said, "Yeah." She goes, "About 3 weeks ago, I became a Christian." And she goes, "And I want to be around people that are going to be good for me. And I don't want to be around those other guys who are expecting the same stuff from me that they got before." And my wife and I had her over for dinner and encouraged her, and just a few days later she moved back to Memphis, Tennessee. Why? Because God is kind to anyone who turns to him. Were they supposed to save Rahab? Were they supposed to feel sorry for her? No. This is what God told them in many ways in different times. He said, "You shall destroy all the peoples that the Lord your God will give over to you. Your eyes shall not pity them." In other words, you must not feel sorry for them. "Neither shall you serve their gods, for that would be a snare to you. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes." And I don't think Rahab was holding her breath. "But you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, just as your Lord God has commanded you." But these 2 spies, who had the heart of Joshua and the heart of the Lord, knew that that was for people who did not turn from their God. But they knew that God is kind to any who turn to him. Well, who knew that Rahab liked fish? Because she married a fellow named Salmon. And Nahshon was the father of Salmon. This is, by the way, the reference is wrong. This is Matthew chapter 1. And Salmon, the father of Boaz. We ever heard of Boaz? Yeah, when we get to the book of Ruth, we're going to talk a lot about Boaz. And he was Rahab's son. Isn't that great? And Boaz marries a gal named Ruth. Does anybody remember where Ruth came from? She's a Moabite from Moab. And God had said on an earlier occasion, "No Moabite shall enter the assembly of the congregation, even to the 10th generation." But God is kind to anybody who turns to him. And Ruth has a son named Obed, and Obed became the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David, the king. Fast forward into the genealogy, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. friends, no matter what you have done in the past, no matter how wicked it was, God is kind to any and to all who will turn to him. And when anybody turns to him, Jeremiah 29:11 is true for him. Behold, I know the plans that I have for you. And guys, they're good. They're really good.